review of adoption of agenda. Mr. O'Reilly.
Sure. I'll move that we adopt the agenda.
Thank you. Clerk's review of agenda. Thank
you, Mr. Chair. On the agenda today, we have a public briefing from Alternatives North. And after that, committee will have a small amount of in-camera business to consider. Just a few items that are listed on the agenda package there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Ball. The hearing changes the agenda. I can have a motion to approve the agenda as presented. Mr. Johnson. Thank you, Mr. Johnson. Member of committee of will adopt the agenda. Member Emily to have moved the adoption agenda. This motion is in order to favor. All favor the motion? Opposed? Motion is carried. Thank you, committee. Having reviewed the adoption agenda, there are any declaration of conflict of interest? Seeing none. Our first public matter. Good morning, Mr. Bromley, Mr. McLean, and Mr. Robinson. Before we begin with your opening remarks, I'd like to discuss how the meeting will proceed. All comments and questions remarked will become to me as the chair. Both members, witnesses will need to wait to be recognized by the chair before speaking. This process will require the committee clerk to turn off on your microphones. Before we turn things over to the witnesses' presentation, I'd like members to introduce themselves for the record. Ms. Martel.
Frida Martellus for Tabacha.
Rylan Johnson, MLA for Yellowknife North.
Ron Bonatus, MLA Decho.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
And myself again, Jackie Jacobson, MLA Nunavut. Thank you, members. Thank you, members. Thank you, members. Thank you, members. Thank you, committee. Mr. Bromley, the floor is yours. 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 Your volume. Your volume. Your volume. Your volume.
Trying to get access here.
Okay, Mr. Bromley, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and it's a great privilege to speak to your committee here, and thank you very much for taking us up on the request to present. I'd like to very briefly just introduce Alternatives North. I know I provided a background, and that should provide you with a little more detail. Alternatives North has been around for more than 25 years, focused on public policy for the common good of all NWT residents. It is completely volunteer. When we are doing a project and we need expertise, we do contract that expertise and we seek funding from amongst our members or a government source or as intervenor funding, this sort of thing. Membership includes churches, members of churches, labor unions, environmental organizations, women and family advocates, seniors, anti-poverty groups, and the like. Most recently, we've been involved in things like No Place for Poverty Coalition. We have a membership on that, sponsored by your government. We're very active with the living wage. We've done calculations for Hay River, Inuvik, and Yellowknife. Very active in legislation that GNWT puts forward, such as the Mineral Resources Act review, Environmental Protection Act, Environmental Rights Act, Protected Areas Act, Waters Act, and so on. Climate action is another area of our activity. Child care. When there's a territorial election, we sponsor forums to encourage the public to have access to candidates. We have held recently public sessions, such as we sponsored the Unearthing Justice author Joan Kuyak from Mining Watch Canada, The mine securities and closures, we've had representatives of Lands, GNWT, and Mackenzie Land and Water Board present to the public and be available to ask questions and answer questions and so on. 2 years ago, following up on that sort of approach, we hired engineer Andrew Robinson here today with us to do a report on whether it was feasible to reach zero carbon emissions, given today's technology. And the most recent report is a follow-up where we hired Andrew and again, as well as Lachlan McLean, and they will now go over the report to look at how we could achieve 50% emissions within 30 years, which is a United Nations goal for the Northwest Territories. And I'll leave it at that, Mr. Chair. I'm available to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Bromley. Committee, any chair questions for Mr. Bromley at this time? Seeing none. Mr. Bromley, who would you like to go first? Andrew or Mr. Robinson? Mr. Robinson, you have the floor.
Just unmuting. Is that working?
Yes.
Yep.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Greetings to all the members. And I'm being told that we've got 20 minutes to get through this, so I'm going to proceed fairly rapidly and assume that if you have questions, make a note and let us know at the end. We can discuss any slide in more detail. So we're on the cover page right now. I'll move to page 2, which is an introduction to myself and Lachlan. I should mention, Mr. Bromley mentioned that I'm an engineer. At the moment, I've retired as an engineer. I'm actually staying at home and looking after my son. So engineering is a registered profession, and you have to be clear when you are acting as an engineer and when you're not. So I am not. Lachlan is, so he bears responsibility for all the facts in this report. A little bit about myself. You can see perhaps in the picture in the top left, that's me when I was a kid. I grew up in a place that's now known as Nunatsiavut, a village called Makovic. And that's me standing in front of the power plant, which was pretty new at that time. And you'll see the rocks all around are painted with diesel and old motor oil, and there's smoke coming out of those pipes out of the building. There's no mufflers on those things, and there's people drying fish right in front of the diesel plant. And I put that picture up just to remind people of how far we've come in energy in the north. Nobody would dream of either spilling a drum of diesel anymore, nor would they dry fish in front of a power plant. And as we move forward into the next century, we're going to change again how we're using our energy and electricity. Now I live in Yellowknife. I've been here for 15 years, and there's me with my son canoeing on the Yellowknife Bay. And Lachlan has been up here for 10 years. He's a former chief engineer at Acadie Diamond Mines. We'll move to the next slide, please. The presentation today, there's 5 things we're going to look at. We're going to first talk about what would an emergency response to climate change look like. We'll talk a little bit about greenhouse gas emissions in the NWT, where they come from, and where we need to take action. We're going to look at the options that we looked at in the study. We've got 3, we think, surprisingly affordable conclusions, ways to reduce emissions, and then we'll go over our recommendations. We'll go to the next slide, which is showing some pictures of emergencies. And you may have heard some discussion recently about the idea that climate change should be treated as an emergency. And it's been considered urgent for a long time. But if you think about other emergencies and how we respond to those and compare that to how we're responding to climate change, it's an interesting exercise to do. For example, if your house was on fire, it's fairly clear that you would call a fire truck, because a fire truck is effective and rapid, is going to get there quickly, is going to help you deal with your fire. If you called for a fire truck and someone told you that a fire truck was too expensive, and instead there's snowplow that was going to be coming around, in a few days or maybe a few hours, and they could plow some snow towards your house, and that wouldn't cost us any more, you would not be happy with that, because that's affordable, but it's not effective. And in the same thing, if you called for a fire truck and the person on the line said, well, we don't have a fire truck, but we're going to be buying a water bomber next year, and that's surely going to be great, because that'd be able to put out forest fires and anything. We said, well, that's not the right response either, because that's very nice. A water bomber is expensive and fancy, but it's actually the wrong solution. And as we go through the different solutions we looked at, some of them are similar to a fire truck, some of them are similar to sending a snowplow to a house fire, and some of them are similar to buying a water bomber. Next slide, please. This is a picture that shows youth in Yellowknife. There are over 1,000 of them last fall in front of City Hall, and they were protesting about the lack of a response on climate change. So if there's confusion about why the youth are upset, and that's around the world, one of the main reasons is that nobody in the world is really taking climate change seriously and treating it as an emergency. And that was also the reason why Alternatives North decided to look at this study, is to try looking at the climate change problem as an emergency, not as a reducing the cost of living thing, or not as an opportunity for economic development or any other of our very valid priorities. If we took it as climate change was number one, what would it look like? So next slide, we've got a cover of the report again. So we're looking at serious action on reducing emissions in the Northwest Territories. That's 50% cut. And how quickly could we do that if we took it seriously? And another emergency obviously has been this pandemic recently, and I think we've all been amazed at what our governments can do when they take something seriously. A few months ago, we would never have considered what they actually managed to accomplish. And congratulations to the NWT on keeping the pandemic outside our borders for now. Next slide. Here's a big pie chart that shows where our emissions are right now. So we're getting into the section now on looking at the problem. Where do we get greenhouse gases from in the Northwest Territories? Pie chart is great. It has a lot of detail. You'll see the big sections are mining and heavy equipment. And then it gets down into smaller things that are in the communities.
Power.
So there's an easier way to look at this. We're on the next slide now, which shows a picture of a mine taking up most of the slides, and communities only taking up a quarter of the slides. So it's interesting to know that we probably could estimate that 98% of the politics in the assembly is talking about stuff that's going on in the community. Bob, I think you need to mute your microphone. So I said 98% of politics in the assembly is about things that are happening in our communities, but that's only the source of 25% of our emissions. And often I've heard climate change discussed, and it ends up being a discussion about the cost of electricity, which if you look at the previous slide, which I won't ask you to go back to, but it's less than 5% of our emissions. So when we're going to deal with greenhouse gas emissions in the Northwest Territories, we have to talk about mining and things that are happening outside of the communities if we're going to take it seriously. We'll move to the next slide. This should show you a picture of a B-train truck hauling diesel fuel, which is something I think we've all seen. We want to keep this discussion in language that everybody can understand. This could be also useful in talking with your constituents about this. If we take all the fuel that we use in the Northwest Territories and we put them in these B-train double tanker trucks, they would line up from Yellowknife to about halfway down to the Detroit Bridge, which is 7,200 B-trains. So to put it in real numbers and something we can imagine, we're talking about trying to get rid of 3,600 trucks, enough from Yellowknife to Betchico, in reductions in fuel use. And we're going to move to the next slide, which is a map of Canada. And the reason we're showing you this is the yellow part of the map is showing where where solar energy is really strong. Down in southern Alberta is really the best place. And the green blotches that you see in the mountains, that's where it's really windy. So it tends to be windy along coastlines and in southern Alberta again. And the white lines that you see connecting things together, those are transmission lines. So in the rest of Canada, the idea for how to tackle climate change and emissions is to connect the sunny parts and the windy parts together with the hydro systems, with the white transmission lines. And that way, when it's sunny, you can use solar power. When it's windy, you can use wind power. And when those don't work, you can use hydropower. And you can turn everything over to electricity. You can use heat from electricity. You can drive your car on electricity. That's what they're doing down south. And we looked at that option for the north. But if you look up to where you can sort of see Great Slave Lake in the top middle left part, and there's a little bit of some white lines. One of them is the Norman Wells oil pipeline, and there's some white lines, which are our small hydro systems. But the rest of the territory is very big and very dark, because we don't have as much solar power as they do in the rest of Canada, and we don't have that much wind either outside of the Arctic coastline and up at some of the diamond mines. The rest of the place is not that windy. And I can tell you that because Labrador, you can see where I grew up, it's green. And there, when you would go outside the door, your hat would blow off immediately, unless you had it jammed hard on your head. And I'm pretty sure that's never happened to me here. And that's a sense of how strong the wind needs to be to really generate good wind power. Anyway, we're moving on. We have to remember that the North is different from Canada, and it's different from a lot of what we hear in the media about solutions. So just adopting solutions from the rest of Canada might not work in the North because we're so spread out, and we're in the North. It's a different place. So we're moving to the next slide. We're looking now at the 8 options that we studied. There are 8 of them, and basically what we tried to do was compare them all on the same basis. We looked at 20 years, how much would it cost to build it, how much would it cost to operate it, and how many B trains of fuel is it going to get rid of. So all of those different 8 things, we compared them all over 20 years, and we added up the costs of operating and building, and then we divided that by the emissions savings. So we get a price per ton of emissions savings. And that way we can compare very different ideas. So the 8 things we looked at were buying carbon offsets, which I'll talk about a bit more later. Renewable diesel, also talk about that later. Waste heat from generators. That's something that has been done a little bit in the North already. Community wood pellet boilers. I think the building that you're in right now is heated by a wood pellet boiler, and the NWT has been doing a good job of converting some of its facilities. I believe also Stantec, the new hospital, is on a pellet boiler. The new building downtown Yellowknife is also on a wood pellet boiler. But we're looking at doing this bigger, like let's get the whole community onto a wood pellet boiler. We also looked at wood pellets as a way of generating electricity at mines. They do this at sawmills in British Columbia, where they take waste wood and they use it to generate steam, and they generate their own electricity. And a mine could do that using wood pellets here. We looked at the transmission line under Great Slave Lake. We also looked at the transmission line under Great Slave Lake, adding in Taltson Hydro. And we looked at solar and wind, which are quite common, often thought of as the main solutions for energy and renewable energy in the North. So moving on, you'll now see a chart showing lots of numbers, and that's to show you that we did our homework. And I'm not going to go into all the details of it. Just again, you'll see that we show the 20-year investment income or loss. We show the capital cost. And we did look also at impact on human health, employment in the north, and self-sufficiency. But they're secondary priorities compared to getting rid of greenhouse gas emissions. So what are the 3 solutions that I promised we would bring up? Number 1, community wood pellet boilers. They can also be combined with taking heat off generators that are in many of our communities. If you combine them together, you could generate enough heat and run it through a network of pipes to most of the community buildings and the houses that are at least around the center part of town. So you create a network, you put in a big wood pellet boiler, you buy all the pellets at once and run them in this boiler, and then distribute the heat throughout the community. And we figured that you could reduce people's heating bills by 20% and still make $80 million profit over 20 years after you've paid for the $140 million cost of doing this. So it's a big project. It's, I think, perfect for this type of thing where we're talking right now about how are we going to reboot the economy after the pandemic. This doesn't require any environmental studies. The technology is already in most of our communities. It's just a matter of putting pipes in the ground and hooking people up. Unfortunately, though, like I said, communities are only a quarter of our emissions. So taking a large portion of the fuel we use for heating is only the equivalent of 400 of those trucks, and we're looking for 3,600. So it's a good start. It would do a real good job of reducing emissions in the communities, but at the mines, they already use the waste heat from their generators. They're smart. They also have investors who want a good return on their money, so they've done this 20 years ago, right from when they built the mines. All of them use the waste heat already, so we can't ask them to do that because they're already doing it. So next slide, please, is talking about offsets. It turns out you can purchase certificates that show that emission projects have been done in other parts of the world. And this has been done since the 90s already, where you put money into other parts of the world to get them to do things that they can't afford to do. For example, in this picture, there's a fella in a village in Africa who's got a solar panel charging cell phones and a computer that they would have needed to use a small generator to do, just like we do at our cabins, right? So these guys live on $2 or $3 a day. They can't afford a $100 solar panel, but we can. And if we send the money over to them, we can get a certificate showing that the generator that they had is not being used anymore. And that turns out to be the cheapest way to reduce emissions from the north. It might be a bit difficult to understand that, but it turns out everything is more expensive in the north. We know that. A jug of juice is more expensive, cheese is more expensive, and so is solar power. So it's cheaper to do it somewhere else. If we really wanted to reduce emissions quickly, that would be the fastest and cheapest way to do it. Next slide is showing a diesel pump. This is from when I actually took a road trip last spring, and I went down to California with my diesel Volkswagen, and I found a renewable diesel pump that was selling renewable diesel for $4 a gallon. That's what the R99 on that pump means. So renewable diesel is a fuel that's made from plant oil and fat. It's run through a refinery the same way they run the tar sands stuff through a refinery. So you use fat and oil and you get diesel out, and it's exactly the same as fossil diesel. So you don't have to modify the engines or anything like that. It's great for the north because it can be formulated to run at low temperatures, just like our diesel can. And it can put it into everything. You can put it into generators, you can put it into furnaces, boilers, trucks, heavy equipment. It'll run in anything. The only problem with it is that it costs roughly $1.60 a liter, which you'll know is more. That's bulk price, so that's more than it costs to get regular diesel. So it would need a subsidy if we don't want to increase the cost of living. Subsidy would be about 65 million a year, which it's a lot, but it's within the realm of the kind of money we spend on other stuff. Probably about the same as what we spent on fighting forest fires in some years. Now, next slide. Some of the things that did not look as good as those previous three ideas. One was the transmission line under Great Slave Lake. This was estimated that it would cost, we're using the government's figures from a presentation they did a while ago. So looking at almost $3 billion over 20 years. It would require a much bigger subsidy than carbon offsets or renewable diesel. And even if we got the line paid for by another government, say federal government paid for the whole thing, you still have to pay for maintenance. And you can say the same thing about some of the hydro we have now, where most of it's been paid off, but we still have to pay for maintenance, and that's why our power rates are still high. So putting a line under the lake is not going to bring us cheap power. And the problem is that even when you get it across the lake, you may hook it up to one mine, but 10 years later, you've got to connect it to another mine, assuming that there is one. And you can see the mines open and close, and it's not always predictable what they're going to do. Even now, we've got one that closed that wasn't supposed to. It might open up again. And it's back to our geography. We're just so big that every time and we want to bring power to a new mine, you have to pay a lot of money for another power line. So it's much more flexible to use a fuel like renewable diesel, that you put it in the same truck that's already going to the mine, and that way, when a new mine opens up, you build a new road that's much cheaper than a power line. A new ice road, that is. So next slide. We also looked at solar, wind, and wood pellets at the mines for generating steam power. All of those are expensive. They're more expensive even than the hydro line under Great Slave Lake. So in the interest of time, I'll keep going. Here's our recommendations. We know that so Alternatives North is a small organization, and we focus on policy. So our recommendations are about policy. First is that there is an energy strategy that's been in place for a few years, and it does not look much like the results of our study. It's focused more on it seems to be focused on the most expensive and least effective ways of reducing emissions. It's kind of like the water bomber approach. You're going to buy something really expensive, and it's not even likely to actually put out your house fire or get there in time. So our recommendations are that the energy strategy should look at carbon offsets. That's the cheapest way to actually reduce emissions. It should look at investing in biomass, so wood pellets and cogeneration that's getting heat from the diesel generators and using that to heat communities. That's profitable. And we think, again, the GNWT should take the lead on this, because most of the buildings are GNWT buildings or their tenants in them. Even in Yellowknife, most of downtown is full of GNWT offices. Number 4, we think renewable diesel has a lot of potential, especially up in the mines, like I was saying. And finally, we were surprised. We think we can get onto renewable diesel within 5 years and get a 50% reduction in 5 years, which is well ahead of what the 2030, the current energy strategy is about. So we think we could get to carbon neutrality within 15 years. So that's, first of all, get 50% reductions done, and then we can be ahead of everybody else and get to carbon neutrality in 15 years. So here's our last slide. I just want to review again what we just talked about. First of all, that if you think of climate change as an emergency, the things you're going to do are different than what we're doing now. And that makes sense, because right now we're using other priorities, not climate change. Our emissions mostly come from mining and outside of the communities, and definitely not from power generation in communities. So Again, if we're talking about emissions, we're talking about different things. The best options that we could find were carbon offsets, renewable diesel, and investing in wood pellet heating systems for our communities. And that, we can go to the next slide. That is the end of our presentation. Hopefully I did it in close to 20 minutes, and thank you for your patience if I didn't.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. I'll thank you for your presentation, and I'd just like to open up the floor to my committee members if they have any questions through the presentation to Mr. Robinson or Mr. Bromley. Committee? Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I love a lot of this. I have a few issues with a few things. I think the biomass district heating is just such a standout and such an obvious win that we should, every single community should be applying for funding, Indigenous governments and the NWT. I'll push that one a little more. I guess one of my concerns is, you know, the $15 million a year for offsets is just kind of, to me, money flowing outside of the GNWT. And I guess I have a little concern with the wording of your recommendations and asking the GNWT to spend that money. And when I look at that chart, that's 75% of our emissions coming from industry. I was hoping someone could speak to, when I see that chart, the most sensible thing to me is to put regulations in place that require industry to then purchase offsets, you know, this carbon trading schemes, or to industry to start using renewable diesel, as opposed to the GNWT just going and taking that money. So I guess if someone, and Bob knows more about this stuff than anyone policy-wise, and same with Andrew and Lachlan, if someone could speak to the thought process of whether we should do this as the GNWT or make industry do it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Johnson. I see Mr. Robinson waving his hand. So, Mr. Robinson.
Yeah, we kept the study was fairly low budget, so we have to keep things simple. And one of the things in an emergency is that we expect government to take a lead in responding to it. We don't have a private sector fire trucks. We don't have private sector forest firefighting because they're emergencies, and the same with healthcare. However, energy policy is more complicated than just saying the government is going to magically come up with $15 million and buy offsets. If the effective solution is offsets, there are ways that you can raise money from industry or from other sources. For example, the $15 million a year is less than the current money that is collected through the carbon tax. So the GNWT already has a policy in place to collect a carbon tax, and that raises more than $15 million a year. So you could buy offsets, reduce your emissions by 50%, and keep the rest for adapting to climate change and other projects. So longer-term projects such as renewable diesel. We didn't suggest that we buy offsets forever. It's the fastest way to reduce emissions, but you do recognize eventually you want to invest in reducing your own emissions. So you start with buying offsets, but then transition towards renewable diesel. And who knows, 20 years from now, perhaps battery technology has become cheaper, or there could be other solutions that allow us to use solar or wind more effectively.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Follow up, Mr. Johnson.
Yeah, I guess I'm also very excited about the prospect of renewable diesel, and I guess my question is, how much possibility is there of actually having these sources produced in the north? I mean, right now when you look at this, it's largely, you know, growing in the States or in the prairies, and we would be shipping it up. And I just don't actually have any sense of the scale of this. You know, you see people convert deep fryer oil, and there's a lot of kind of other oils we're bringing up. But can I just get a sense of the supply chain of renewable diesel right now? Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Johnson. Mr. Robinson?
Maybe I'll ask Lachlan. Would you want to answer that one?
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Mr. Lachlan?
I just want to make sure my speaker works. I have myself muted. Can you hear me,
Yes.
Mr. Speaker?
Yes.
Okay. In regards to renewable diesel supply chain, right now, much of the production is in the United States or in Singapore to serve the low carbon fuel market that California has built through its low carbon fuel standards. And so we're seeing right now in terms of production has been influenced by that. But when we looked at what the requirements of the NWT would be, we found that it would be possible to source that sustainably within just the provinces of British Columbia, Alberta, and Saskatchewan based current published availability of feedstock. And what we also found is currently the largest collector of feedstock in BC, and they are shipping much of their fat and oil to Singapore to be refined into renewable diesel to then be shipped back and sold in California. So what we find promising is that there is the potential there for the market in Canada and for the feedstock to be sourced in Canada and refined in Canada and then used in northern Canada.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson, follow up?
No, but if you guys ever want to meet a separate time, I would like to walk through this report in more detail. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Johnson. Questions to the committee, Mr. O'Reilly?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Mine are going to be, some of my questions are similar to what my colleague, Mr. Johnson, talked about. Yeah, purchasing offsets, I think there's going to be a political dimension to that because the money would be spent outside of the NWT, but maybe you can, what's been the experience in other jurisdictions in terms of purchasing offsets? And at some point, is there ways to purchase offsets or adopt some of the kinds of technologies and things that you know, constitute the offsets and use it in the Northwest Territories, even on a smaller scale in some way, or other Arctic regions or whatever. So I guess I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Robbins.
Yes, thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Again, this study is looking at climate change as the top priority. So that means essential to reduce emissions rapidly and effectively. And that's not to say that other ideas such as promoting economic development in the North, keeping our money in the North, that those things are also important. But if you're taking things in an emergency context, then you want to do the most effective thing rapidly right now. And carbon offsets allow us to take action in other parts of the world faster than we could ever do it here and more affordably. It's kind of like if I use my fire truck analogy, say if your house is on fire and you called up the fire department, he said, can you send a fire truck? And they said, well, no, we don't have one, but there's one available in the next town. And you say, well, I don't want my money to go to the next town. So can you just do something here locally? No, they're going to say, well, I think your house is on fire. You should probably get the action done from the next town and forget about where your money is going right now. Let's just deal with the emergency. So as I said to Mr. Johnson's questions as well, it is desirable in the long term that we reduce emissions locally here. But if we want to do things quickly and effectively, that we may have to make that our top priority. And that means either moving money through offset a bit out of the territory, or we're using money to support agriculture in Western Canada. It's a bit closer to home, but we're not going to be able to grow our own renewable fuels in the north right now. But Mother Earth doesn't actually care. That line on the map was drawn by some colonial guy a while ago, and it's not that important to the environment where we do our emissions reductions. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Mr. O'Reilly, follow up?
Yeah, thanks. No, I get that was the lens with which the study was done, and I certainly appreciate that. Just with regard to where the money might come from in terms of offsets, are there other national governments that are using offsets, to help them meet their obligations under the Paris Agreement? I know that we could use the carbon tax here for some of that, but the way the carbon tax was structured was that most, if not all, of the money goes back to industry right away. So that would obviously be some resistance to changing that regime. I'm okay with it, quite frankly, myself, but I think there's going to be some resistance. But so, what's the experience purchasing offsets, and what do you think some of the challenges are in rejigging the carbon tax to help perhaps fund purchase of offsets here? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. O'Reilly. Mr. Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two things. There are a variety of carbon markets operating in the world. And for example, there's one in the western US. California and Oregon and Washington are working together to trade different emissions reductions amongst their states. And there's another one that involves Quebec and Ontario. But they're fairly complicated regulatory environments and generally deal in really large emitters, so that the cost of the NWT trying to get into one of those markets would probably cost more than it would be worth. It would cost more than $15 million a year just to develop the capacity to participate. And so we're suggesting buying offsets on the voluntary market, which you or I could also purchase, and I do. It's much simpler in terms of regulation and therefore more appropriate for our sources of emissions in the north. The other part about generating revenue from carbon pricing, obviously that the GNWT can, I believe it's just a matter of changing a regulation, it wouldn't require new legislation, because the carbon price is increasing every year as we know. It's part of policy. It's going up $5 a ton every year. And if you look at the fuel price, that's happened just recently, the cost of diesel has dropped a lot. So anybody who's complaining that if we could double the price of carbon right now, and it would still be cheaper than fuel was last year. So all of the mines that were buying fuel at $1.20 a liter last year, you could double or triple the tax on carbon, and they'd still be paying less in this coming year than they were before. So there's certainly room to tax fossil fuels more, certainly now that the price has gone down. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Mrs. Marcellus.
I want to thank the presenters. So I have a problem with the membership. We have many groups, lots of Indigenous groups that I have a mandate out of Fort Smith, because we have the Tolson hydro near Salt River Reserve lands border the Tolson. And the expansion of the Tolson expansion is extremely important to the Indigenous groups in all this area, including Acacia, for ownership. And we go through all these different, membership is extremely important when I'm listening to a group. I also want to know where the funding comes from to make some statements that, for me, the Tolson expansion is the best green energy that you could ever have, and it's going to satisfy all the industry that we want in the future, including all the people that are going to benefit from it, including Yellowknife. So, and getting off diesel is important. So my mandate still stands with the expansion of the Tulsa, and I want to make that very clear to this group. You know, I was born and raised here, and I'm a Denning woman, and I have a group of Indigenous people that are going to own part of this Tulsa expansion, and I'm committed to the mandate of the 22 priorities that we set forth. And just for the record, that's all I don't have any questions for any of the presenters, but I stick by what I believe is correct. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Ms. Martellos. To the floor, Mr. Bonatouche.
Yeah, merci, Mr. Chair. And thank you to the presenters. It's a pleasure meeting you, even if it's virtual. The Alternatives North, I hear of them every now and then as an organization. But, what I read, so I'm understanding them a bit more. I know one of the questions I would have had from this group is what are the expertise, but I do see some of it here. To address the myriad of issues related to alternate heating systems. I'm just wondering if you at all have any peer reviews to your reports, and if the NWT Energy Department is one of them. That's my first question.
Thank you, Mr. Bonatouche. Mr. Robinson?
Sure. Thank you for the question. In terms of Alternatives North, yes, we are mostly a volunteer-driven organization. So the previous question also about budgets and where our money comes from is related to this question as well. We spent less than $10,000 on this study, and most of the work was put in as volunteer time as well. So we're all local people, and we don't have big budgets, and the money that we use all comes locally. So the study, we don't want to pretend that our study is more than it is. It was reviewed by myself and by Lachlan. We both have a long history of working in the North. I've been working on energy for more than 15 years. And at the same time, we did talk to the Department of Infrastructure. Most of our numbers come from them. We're just using published numbers that come from the GNWT and putting it all together with a new perspective. And as far as I know, we haven't had an official response from the Department of Infrastructure, but we did meet with the minister yesterday, and she was quite excited about the renewable diesel options. So we look forward to more communication with the department, and I think that's part of the role of Alternatives North is to provide feedback on government priorities and planning. They have a lot more resources than we do, but we have the luxury of being independent. At least in our view, we have a view that can look at things from a different perspective and provide feedback. And I think that's helpful to the whole process and to your process of considering what Cabinet is proposing.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Mr. Bonatouche?
Yeah, merci for that. And of course, I just want you to know that I do respect the expertise that people bring to the table. My previous job as a project officer, I had the pleasure of working with very many professional engineers and consultants. I'm wondering, we're proposing transmission line going from Hay River to Fort Providence. Well, stopping off in Kakiza and the Dory Point, then to Fort Providence. I think that was in the books for quite a number of years, and it looks like it may come to fruition, hopefully for our community. What that would do, big time, is it gets rid of the greenhouse gas emissions from the current diesel plant that's been running for ages. And it would drop our power rates. We're really hoping that it will, from a current 30-cent kilowatt hour to perhaps 23 cents kilowatt hour. So that would be like significant savings, and especially for one of the big social economic groups that we have that keep complaining about funding is the Northwest Territories Housing Corporation. That would cut their energy costs quite a bit too, through that through that option. And then looking at, your option to say, maybe it's cheaper just to run off of diesel, but then we're trying to get off of diesel. Any system anybody's trying to run through a generation system is eating up diesel. And if they were to expand from current systems, they're still increasing the greenhouse gas emissions. So, in the long run, I see the transmission line as the real savior to the greenhouse or the climate change actions. So I'm wondering if you have any further thoughts to that. And then I had one more question after this. Masi.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Bonatush. Mr. Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, we are aware of that proposal to put a transmission line in across past Kikiza to Fort Providence. That will still be expensive, but I think it's not as anywhere near as expensive as trying to run a line under Great Slave Lake. And I think that perhaps some of the members who are thinking about the potential for Talton Hydro could look at that. The South Slave has potential to use that hydro in the South Slave rather than putting too much money into a line across the lake. You could use it for heating. You could use it to replace the generator in Fort Providence. You could also use it as vehicles start to switch over to electric. If you run that line across past big, the big service station at the Big Bend there, you could end up with an electric vehicle charging station there, another one in Enterprise. That looks more feasible to us than trying to chase mines around the tundra as they pop up and go down again. Because people in South Slave are not going anywhere. And in the long run, I think you could make better use of the hydropower that's available in communities. As far as the comment about diesel, there's a difference between renewable diesel and the diesel we use now. The diesel we use now is called fossil diesel because it's dug up from under the ground. It's it's carbon that was stored by nature a long time ago, and nature stored it down there for a reason because we don't need it in the air. The renewable diesel is made from plants, and that carbon is part of a natural cycle. So even if we're using the same generator or same truck, if we put a renewable fuel in it, that's better for climate change than a fossil fuel. And in the case of Fort Providence and running the line that way, I think you'll find that the transmission line is reasonably affordable compared to either diesel as well. So that could be a good option there. We're not saying all transmission lines are bad and we use diesel for everything, renewable diesel. But you have to look at each situation and see what makes the most sense. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Mr. Bonatrush?
Yeah, Masi Cho for that explanation. I know it's going to take a while for anybody to warm up to using vegetable oil for running furnaces and everything else. That's going to take a while, even if NWT warms up to it. I'm not sure if it'll, go over well with the private enterprise like ATCO Power, which currently is powering power plant in Fort Providence. The other thing too is with these power plants, since I've been into this government here, I've always been trying to throw the idea of a wood pellet boiler into the power plants like NTPC and to ATCO Power without really understanding it fully myself. Is something like that possible to be used with a power generating plant? Let's see.
Thank you, Mr. Bonatush. Mr. Robinson.
Yes, the short answer is yeah, it's possible. I don't know if you know the Snowshoe Inn down in Port Providence. The Snowshoe Inn has its own generator, right? And they were running it on wood smoke for a while. So we did look at that. There's potential to run it on gasified wood or use wood to make steam and generate power that way. But both those things, they turn out to be more expensive than high transmission lines or buying renewable diesel. Again, on the renewable diesel side, I told you I went down to California and I put some in my car myself. And it's made from vegetable oil, but I got some on my hands and it doesn't feel like vegetable oil. It feels like diesel. But when you smell it, it doesn't smell of anything. So it's the same as diesel. It's not just greasy vegetable oil. You have to see it to or experience it to really see what it's like. But it's from the point of view of you're driving your truck, you're not going to know the difference.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson. Any other questions from committee? I'd like to recognize non-committee members if they have any questions. Mr. Cleveland, any questions? If not, committee, any other questions?
I'm good, thank you, Jackie.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Cleveland. Any other questions? If not, anything else to add? Closing remarks, Mr. Bromley.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And I don't know whether the technical expertise here has additional closing comments, but I just wanted to thank you again for this opportunity. It's this sort of vetting that we want to see brought to the products that Alternative North produces. It's part of our peer review and public review. So we want to get this out there. We want to get comments and feedback. So we would welcome comments at any time, now or later. We also really support First Nations. That's part of our approach in economic development opportunities. As you know, there's lots of wastage of water over the dam at the Tulsan right now, and has been for many decades. About 30% of the power produced there goes to waste. So we hope that the government will find some opportunities there to work with First Nations as well. The pellet plants in our communities, that's another economic development opportunity. So again, we really support that approach with GNWT. And I know they have that interest as well. So to all the MLAs and yourself, Mr. Chair, thanks again for this opportunity. Please give us any additional feedback individually or as a committee that you would like. We would welcome it. Thank you again.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Bromley. Thank you for the presentation to all three individuals. Now this portion of the meeting is now complete. Now we're going to thank you again, witnesses, and can I have a motion to go into camera? Mr. Johnson. Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Okay, we're in camera.
Thank you for that.
We're off?
Yes.
Okay, so now grab a coffee, grab something before we get started. We're gonna hammer down, then we're done early.
Is there lunch today, Michael, or?
Mr. Chair, there should be lunch be ready downstairs in a